Hello everyone. So the subject for today is going to be about words and definitions. So it might seem like it's a very obvious everyday thing we do. So how come we need to learn this, let's say? But I think this is one illusion I've come to realize actually that sometimes when I have an issue or a problem at hand, it seems like I don't understand, let's say, the mechanism of something. But then when I look deeper into that problem, it actually turns out that it's a word slash definition problem. So when I look deeper into that problem, the solution lies into understanding the meanings of words in that mechanism, let's say. So it's a very underrated fact about, let's say, understanding the world. Another aspect of this would be what I call consequential reasoning of words. So after we unravel the meaning and the definition of the word, as we said previously, we can move on to another aspect of this, which is seeing the consequence of this meaning or definition at hand, or set of definitions. So if we try to give an example of this, if somebody, let's say, declares the statement of truth doesn't exist, so what this, if we unravel what this statement actually means, and then we look at the consequences of it, one consequence that might unravel is that any discussion is actually not, it's meaningless, it's redundant, because if you assume that truth, which is the common ground we usually approach the world with, doesn't exist, then really any discussion is redundant because you've already declared that there is no common ground, let's say. What it actually implies is that any discussion at all is redundant because there is no common ground for someone to change their mind, for example. So this is one example of actually when we got to understand the meaning and the consequence of the word and definitions, it turns out that actually it makes a lot of things collapse on its face. Now, someone might actually take this approach and overshoot this or overlearn this in some sense. But I think there should be some kind of balance towards this approach because a lot of the times we're bounded by time, let's say, or social approaches in some sense. So I think that this approach for me is more like an internal process in order for us to question our reasoning rather than an external process, because I think that it might get counterproductive in some sense if we try to ask everyone, what do you mean by this every time they say something? So I think we'd have to sometimes suspend this kind of approach with regards to constrained time or constrained, let's say, social approaches. So for me, it's more of a internal approach to actually understand the way my brain works and to understand ideas in general. So this is one caveat I wanted to actually mention. And also to add to the last point, I think it's important to mention that definitions are actually complex. Now, this might seem like it's a silly thing to mention, but I think it's important in our context because one might actually, let's say, dig deep into a definition of a very loaded word, let's say. And then one might not actually find a fulfilling answer towards the actual meaning of the word. But this shouldn't hinder one to actually move on to the next step of understanding a certain topic. And rather, a good example of this would be the word consciousness in the scientific and philosophical discourses. So there is no consensus on the definition of consciousness, but there seems to be some kind of progress towards understanding this concept of consciousness. So the definition here, we look at one example that the definition didn't actually come first, but rather it's reshaping itself within the process of trying to understand it more from other angles. So I think this is almost like an extension to the first point we mentioned about overlearning this approach. And I think the most productive approach towards this kind of investigation would be to actually add it to the archive of other approaches towards understanding the world, rather than take it in a, let's say, a linear manner, for example. I think that this approach is actually powerful because it speaks to mathematics in some sense. Because if you look at mathematics, it actually tries to formalize its propositions and make it rigorous. So this approach actually is somehow trying to mimic this, but rather on the individual perspective, not on the language perspective, because we know that logically mathematics and natural language are actually very different. So we can't really make natural language as clear as mathematics, but we can almost make natural language more clear on the individual level rather than the on the language level, for example. So I think this is one way to actually think about this in comparison to mathematics. I'll attach the link of the blog post in the description and hopefully see you soon with another video.